Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the upcoming No Kings rallies across the country on Saturday, the third of which is likely to be bigger, with anti-war sentiments swelling the ranks, although the Iran war is not the focus of the organisers. We'll discuss growing grassroots activism against the multiple MAGA disasters tearing us down at home and abroad, with airports clogged as travellers wait in long lines, watched over by ICE goons, while Trump stops 11 attempts by Democrats to fund TSA, trying to force Republicans to shoehorn the Voter Suppression SAVE Act into Senate DHS funding negotiations. Joining us is Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he's a professor of history and public affairs. He's the co-host of the podcast This is Democracy, and the author and editor of a number of books, including The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, and most recently, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. He has an article at his Substack, Democracy of Hope, Iran is winning so far. Then we'll examine whether a Congress that automatically approves Pentagon spending on a bipartisan basis will balk at the extra $200 billion Hegseth wants for the Iran war and the extra $500 billion Trump is asking for on top of the $1 trillion defense budget already approved. Joining us is William Hartung, a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute. His books include Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex, and his latest book is The $1 Trillion War Machine, How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts us at Home. And he has an article at Forbes we will discuss. $200 billion for the Pentagon means a longer war and more wasted funds. Then finally, as Trump postpones his summit with China's Xi while cutting off Persian Gulf oil China depends on, we will speak with Frank Dikötter, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and chair professor of humanities at the University of Hong Kong. He's the author of a number of books, including The Discourse of Race in Modern China and People's Trilogy, which documents the lives of ordinary people under Mao. His latest book is Red Dawn over China, How Communism Conquered a Quarter of Humanity. And before we begin with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now, Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is a professor of history and public affairs, and he has an article at his Substack, Democracy of Hope, Iran is Winning So Far. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jeremi Suri.
Always good to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jeremi. And I obviously want to talk to you about the upcoming No Kings on Saturday rallies, 3,000 across the country, as well as the gridlock on Capitol Hill with the Senate stalled over funding DHS and in particular TSA. But let's start with your article that I just mentioned, Iran is winning so far. You point out that the mullahs and Putin are getting richer while Americans, Europeans, Asians and others pay more, and that Tehran has distracted world attention from its long history of terrorism and violent repression, and now it's evoking sympathy as the victim of a foreign bombardment. And on the military side, we're learning from the New York Times today that the 13 U.S. military bases in the region, where there's about 40,000 American troops, were normally located. They're all but uninhabitable, and that the servicemen that were killed in the strike on Port Shubaya in Kuwait, that was an Army Tactical Operations Center. The Iranians have also hit the Ali al-Salem Air Base and the Camp Buring. And then in Qatar, Iran has struck the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the headquarters of U.S. Central Command. In Bahrain, they've attacked the communications headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. And at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, they've damaged communications equipment and several refueling tankers. So Hegseth is whining about, and so is Trump, about the press not rah-rah cheering on his glorious victories. But we're not really hearing much about what the Iranians are achieving, and it looks like they've made some pretty targeted strikes so far. What's your understanding?
Well, this is not surprising to a military historian, right? Our enemy is not dumb. They might be horrible leaders in Iran, but they understood that if the United States attacked them, they needed to have a strategy, and they had a strategy in place that involved attacking our assets in the region, closing the Strait of Hormuz, and using geography to their advantage and using asymmetrical warfare to their advantage. And they had plenty of models from Iraq and Libya and Lebanon over the last 40 years. And so we should not be surprised that the Iranians have done any of the things that you described. What is surprising is that we in the United States were unprepared for that. We once again assumed our enemies were dumb and would roll over in the face of our power. That is never the case in warfare and rarely the case in the Middle East.
Well, we have a president who's completely delusional. He's a reality TV guy. He's now trapped in his own delusion. He thought this would be a cakewalk. He was told it would be a cakewalk by Netanyahu and by Jared Kushner and Witkoff, who now the Iranians say they don't want to negotiate with. They want to negotiate with J.D. Vance because he thought two are total liars and set them up last time. So you can well imagine why they don't want to talk to them again. So Trump basically, is clueless. He's trapped in his own delusions. And Hegseth, he's all about how many push-ups you do and getting rid of facial hair. So this is a massive problem. You just pointed out, Jeremy, that as noxious as the Iranian leaders are, they're not stupid. But our leaders are both noxious and stupid.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think also we don't have a process. Traditionally, when you make policy, you articulate a set of goals, and then you have a debate within your administration among experts of different kinds as to what are the feasible ways of achieving a goal, what are the risks, what are the things you need to prepare for, and what are the ways you can pursue your goals while minimizing risks and being prepared for various kinds of things that will happen that will inevitably undermine what you expect. That's what a policy planning process is all about. What we have instead is we have a court being run out of the White House, a regal court, where people hang around the president and make proposals to him, and he affirms something, accepts a proposal, and people are told to go and run with it without any feedback, without any discussion of what that means. And that hobbles the preparatory and planning process for policy, and it leads you to exactly these kinds of outcomes. It's as if you, as a family, instead of thinking through your income and allocating your resources, simply spent by whim and then figured out somehow to try to keep your family from going bankrupt. That's the environment we're in right now in terms of military planning.
So let's turn to what's happening on Capitol Hill, where you've got a deadlock over funding for DHS and, more importantly, TSA. And the Democrats have had 11 attempts to fund TSA, to stop all of this gridlock and these long lines at airports where you've got these ICE goons watching people as God knows what else they're doing, but they're essentially there as people wait in long lines and getting more and more upset. And clearly this is a political hot potato. But the Democrats keep wanting to fund TSA, but they're blocked by Republicans who are under pressure from Trump to shoo in his Voter Suppression Save Act into the Senate's DHS funding negotiations. So, and that's, obviously a massive no from the Democrats. Whether they're going to cave, I pray that they don't. But, so far the Republicans seem to be holding on to keeping the filibuster, which is what's at stake here. Where do you think this thing is heading? Because I don't understand why the Democrats can't make it clear that they are not responsible for these long lines at airports. It's Trump who's trying to force his Voter Suppression Act into this bill, because that's the only way that the Republicans are going to win in November.
Right. I do think the Republicans are losing on this issue. In a place like Houston, here in Texas, where you've had some of the longest lines, people at the airport there are blaming their senators, and both of their senators are Republicans, one of whom is up for re-election this year, John Cornyn. And so this is definitely helping the Democratic challenger, James Tallarico. And that's very concerning to Republicans, because that race could determine the future control of the U.S. Senate. So if you look at the electoral map, what is happening with TSA is angering voters against incumbents, who they're angry that those incumbents are not funding TSA, and there are more Republican incumbents up in various locations. So this will hurt Republicans more than Democrats, which is why even Senator Ted Cruz is calling for separate funding for TSA. The problem is that the president, not the Republicans in the Senate, the president won't go along with that. He's demanding this voter suppression bill to be passed above the filibuster. I don't think that's going to happen. There are not enough Republicans who want to break the filibuster, nor enough Republicans who support that bill to break the filibuster over it. So I think where this is headed is that the president is going to declare a national emergency and find some way to pay TSA temporarily from other government funds. But that will be a victory for the Democrats, because note that outcome will not provide any new funding to ICE. And that is the goal of the Democrats right now, not to fund ICE any further until ICE makes fundamental reforms that the White House has not agreed to so far.
And on the other big upcoming third No Kings rally on Saturday, apparently there are at least 3,000 planned demonstrations, two-thirds of which are not in urban areas, although it's the urban areas in both rural and urban and red and blue states where there's enormous uptick in anger at Trump and MAGA and amongst independents and even Republicans. So it seems to me that the Democrats have already won suburban America, and now these No Kings are reaching into rural America. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I think we are seeing much more discomfort among rural Americans, some of whom supported Donald Trump. They're feeling discomfort because of the obvious economic consequences of this war in Iran, which has raised gasoline prices and raised other fuel costs. And for farmers, this is absolutely crucial. They need to run their machinery. At the same time, they're also dealing with higher costs for labor on their farms because they don't have immigrant labor. And so everything is worse. And if you turn to a place like Indiana, which has been a stronghold of Republican votes for Donald Trump, they are soybean farmers. The cost of their soybeans to produce has gone up, but the market value of the soybeans has gone down because the Chinese are not buying them in the same quantity due to tariffs as well. So the farmers are getting hit in all directions, and these rural communities are suffering more than they did under Joe Biden. And that doesn't make them Democrats overnight, but it makes them very unhappy, Ian, with the current president.
So what does this mean for the Democrats, though, with their perennial argument between the center and the left, and the notion being that the only way, and look what happened with Kamala Harris, she spent all the time with Liz Cheney trying to shore up and peel off a handful of disaffected Republicans. So that proved to be disastrous. But on the other hand, the Democratic establishment is still terrified of their own left wing, but it looks as if there's been a massive political change in this country where AOC and Mondani and Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders' protégés are the most popular politicians in America.
I think there is something to that because I think that part of the Democratic Party is not the part that speaks to the New York and California billionaires and Austin billionaires, but speaks instead to ordinary Americans who are finding the country less affordable, who are struggling to provide health care and struggling to get good schools for their kids. And we need to speak to those pocketbook bread and butter issues for ordinary Americans of all kinds. I have no problem with people of transgender choices playing sports, but that should not be the issue that Democrats talk about. They should talk about affordability. They should talk about housing. They should talk about education. That's what matters to people, and not fighting foreign wars where we're spending $2 billion a day that we're not spending on ourselves at home. I think the model for this is really the Democratic candidate in Texas for the Senate, James Tallarico. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with him. He makes a very bread and butter issue about a country that has to serve its people better. He sees that as what God's calling is for the United States. It is a progressive message, but the language he uses is not a language of radicalism. It's a language of common sense and basic moral value. And I think that's where the party has to go.
And also, Tallarico seems to be zeroing in on not on the affordability issue, which is symptomatic of the broader issue of inequality, isn't it? That
Yes.
This is not about left versus right. This is about people at the top versus the massive majority at the bottom.
Precisely right. It's not left versus right. It's top versus bottom. It's ordinary citizens getting a fair shake versus a government right now that puts everything into a few people at the very top.
So what's the feeling down there, the zeitgeist, in terms of Tallarico?
Well, at the moment, actually, the polls are showing him ahead of both Republican contenders. He's in an ideal situation because John Cornyn, the Republican incumbent, and Paxton, the attorney general, the impeached attorney general, who is running for the Senate now, they're in a runoff, so they will be fighting each other and spending money. Tallarico is attracting a lot of attention around the state. He has a very good shot, but he still fights an uphill battle because there's such a negative view of Democrats in general in the state. And he is struggling to articulate a progressive agenda, but one that doesn't sound like a radical agenda. And that's the challenge.
So why is there a negative view? I mean, just in the last minute here, because, you had LBJ and you did have Democratic Senators Lloyd Benson, but not since then. You haven't. Well, you also had that colourful governor as well.
Ann Richards.
Ann Richards, right.
Yeah, so I think the real reason, and it's not necessarily fair, but that Democrats were seen for a long time as out of touch. They were seen as overeducated people who cared about issues like transgender rights, et cetera, and didn't care about ordinary men in rural communities.
And Tallarico's changing that.
He's making the appeal that he cares about ordinary people, that he's following the teachings of Jesus and saying that every person has a right to a good education. Every person has a right to health care.
Well, Jeremi, I thank you for joining us, and I'd like to keep in touch because it sounds like we should be watching Texas.
I think you should. It might determine the future of the U.S. Senate.
And again, I've been speaking with Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he's a professor of history and public affairs. He's the co-host of the podcast This is Democracy and the author and editor of a number of books, including The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, and most recently, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. And he has an article at his Substack, Democracy of Hope, Iran is Winning So Far. We're going to take a brief station break and back examining whether a Congress that automatically approves Pentagon spending on a bipartisan basis will balk at the extra $200 billion Hegseth wants for the Iran war and the extra $500 billion Trump is asking for on top of the $1 trillion defense budget already approved.
Senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. The battle outside raging, will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changing.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is William Hartung, Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute. His books include Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. And his latest book is The $1 Trillion War Machine, How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts it at Home. And he has an article at Forbes, $200 billion for the Pentagon means a longer war and more wasted funds. Welcome to Background Briefing, William Hartung.
Yes, good to be back despite the circumstances.
Well, indeed, Bill. And we're now learning that by the end of the week, the Trump administration's war on Iran will likely have cost $25 billion. And even though Trump is sending mixed signals, saying he's paused his ultimatum for 5 days and says he's negotiating, even though the Iranians say no such negotiations are taking place. He obviously wants to get out of this war, but at the same time, the Marines are on their way. So who do we believe in this? I mean, you've got Trump, Netanyahu, MBS. None of these people are particularly reliable. How do we know what's happening, and how could lawmakers possibly appropriate more money when they don't know what the strategy is and, more importantly, what the end game is?
Well, it's hard to tell with this administration between lying and incompetence. Probably a mixture. In Congress, even some of the Republicans are having a little bit of doubts because it's $1 trillion Pentagon budget, biggest since World War II. Trump wants to have $500 billion, which is virtually impossible with our industrial base. And then the $200 billion on top of that, even though they're not telling us what it's being spent for, how long the war is going to go. Even if he ends, I wouldn't put it past him to try to get the money. So Congress has to defeat this, but it probably means more pressure on Republicans and some of these Democrats who say the right thing and vote the wrong way.
Well, we're learning now in terms of DHS, which is shut down, and obviously people are having troubles at airports across the country, and now ICE has been deployed. We're learning now that from Republican senators, Kennedy and Cruz, that they went to John Thune and said, let's just make a deal with the Democrats and end this shutdown. And Trump weighed in and said, no way. He wants this problem to continue. So he's still telling the Republican Congress what to do, particularly the Senate, what to do.
Well, the problem is almost everybody who's challenged Trump, voted for impeachment, supported January 6th, has either retired or been primaried and lost. I mean, Lord knows I never thought I'd side with Liz Cheney on anything, but I think you should count the votes, And so, they're afraid to lose their jobs, but frankly, we're on the verge of an even worse war. It's, they're dismantling our democracy. Risk your damn job. I mean, what are they there for?
Well, when are they going to stand up to this guy? Do you think that this war is going to weaken him because it's such a catastrophe? At what point will they have permission to recognize his weakness? I mean, the polls would indicate that he's losing the support of the American people and even his MAGA base.
Yeah, I think if they think Trump's going to take them down with them at the midterms, which of course they're going to make very difficult, maybe there'll be some turns. There's some unlikely suspects. Of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert of all people, Thomas Massey. In some cases, they don't need a lot of votes to make a difference. But I mean, Trump is a terrible imperialist. He's basically a pathological narcissist. So rising gas prices, tanking economy, alienating your trading partners, cutting off essential labor. I mean, a lot of business has to be concerned about this, but they too have been bending the knee for the most part. So we need some people to stand up. I mean, like bowing down to a bully can be infectious, but so can standing up to one. And I think we need a lot of people that are doing that are just basic everyday folks. They're not business leaders, not university leaders, not donors. Some of those folks are going to also have to speak out.
Well, the one thing that's bipartisan in this otherwise polarized politics that we have, particularly on Capitol Hill, is the defense budget. The Democrats and the Republicans just vote in a zombie-like way as the budget goes up and up and up. And as you pointed out, Bill, it's now at $1 trillion. Trump wants another $500 billion. And does he also want this extra $200 billion that he's asking for on top of that? That'd be $1,700.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
Exactly. It'd be 1.7 trillion, which is about double what it was a couple of years ago. A few Republicans on the Hill said, well, we can't physically spend $500 billion. And there's not enough factories, not enough workers. No, they said, well, let's do it over 5 years. And this is classical Trump. I mean, nobody's ever suggested we raise the Pentagon budget 50% in 1 year. What if it gets 20%? Still more than he deserves and more than the industry deserves. So, they set the bar high, and then, if they chip a little off the top, some of the Democrats will claim victory.
Well, his ideas, though, for spending this money are just so stupid. The Trump battleship, they can't possibly agree to that. And the Golden Dome, I mean, are they? I mean, I know they're actually spending money on the Golden Dome, but none of these things, even with the history of gold-plated, big ticket items that go out of control in terms of spending, these go beyond that, don't they? I mean, we've never had these kind of stupid.
No, we haven't. I mean, Mark Hansen, who's a former Pentagon insider, said, first of all, the expense for these battleships is, only to be determined after all the cost overruns. And the Navy was moving the other way, smaller, more nimble ships. Trump, of course, wants big, beautiful ships. So there's that. Golden Dome is, warmed over Reagan umbrella, leak-proof defense, adding, well, let's also deal with hypersonic missiles, low-flying cruise missiles, drones. And the conservative American Enterprise Institute said, well, if he seriously tried to do that, it would cost $3.6 trillion over the next 3 decades. They might need 500 interceptors for each incoming ICBM. So it's not going to happen, but it's going to be a huge gold mine, not just for the traditional contractors who will build the hardware, but the Silicon Valley bros who will make the software. So it's kind of to me, it's a marketing scheme to pretend that they're defending us, and it's a money-making scheme. So the head of the program actually told some colleagues of mine, yeah, I know we can't do a leak-proof defense, but we got to humor Trump and at least test some weapons in space, which is extremely dangerous. Even in the Cold War, they didn't put weapons in space because satellites are so vulnerable. And you can call it a missile interceptor, but you can use it to take out satellites, which are on a predictable orbit, which would mean the ability to knock out the power grid, military targeting, the whole thing. So they've gone many steps beyond. I mean, they're inching back into Cold War territory and worse. And it's, you can say it's the military-industrial complex. It's a dying empire flailing out, but you have to consider the Trump factor, just the erratic nature of it, the egotism, which I think, even under George W. Bush, some of his military folks says invading Iran doesn't make sense. It's a tougher target than Iraq, could lead to a region-wide war, and here we are. And
Right.
Definitely, I think the Israeli bombing, at least catalyzed him to follow suit. And I think he thought this would be relatively easy, sort of like depose a leader, put in a better leader, add water, and you have a pro-American regime. And now they're facing a war in the region and saying, gee, we're running out of interceptors. Well, if the interceptors cost $1 million and the drones cost 10,000 and they can target nearly anywhere, of course they're going to run out. The reason they're running out is because they're waging a stupid, unnecessary war.
So when you talk about battleships and these stupid plans of Trump's, and by the way, you have to add grift and graft surely to the equation, because Trump's and his family are making money out of, instead of having the State Department run our foreign policy, we've got this grifter son-in-law, Jared, out there, making business deals on the side. You've got the graft at DHS, where they're buying up massive warehouses around the country and spending 5, 6, 7, 8 times what the buildings were on sale for, these vast warehouses. So somebody's making a ton of money in kickbacks. So across the board, I'm sure, and we don't even know what's going on with Trump vacillating one way or the other. People say he doesn't know what he's doing, which is true, but maybe there's a method to his madness. As you make these swings, the oil market goes up and down in 24 hours. The same with the stock market. You can make a lot of money on short selling, and apparently there's some evidence that there's been a lot of short selling.
Yes, they go on Polymarket and do legalized insider trading.
Yeah. So
Senator Merkley is trying to put a stop to that, but knowing these folks, they would ignore the law.
Right. So, but in terms of the big ticket items, when we were talking about the ludicrous nature of the Trump battleship. We already have an example of the biggest ticket item in the Navy, the biggest ship in the United States Navy, is the USS Gerald Ford, and now it's in dry dock in Crete. It's been on an extended deployment because it was diverted to the Caribbean for the Venezuela operation, and then it was sent to the Gulf. And apparently the crew are so upset at this long deployment, there's a likelihood, at least as far as I can tell, that there was sabotage in the laundry room. The fire was set, hundreds of beds were lost, and then the plumbing was all screwed up to the point where apparently there was human feces on the flight deck. So what's going on with that? Is that ship a problem in terms of having, technical problems and not properly finished off by the contractor, or are the crew sabotaging it?
I think it might be a little of both. I mean, these things are complicated. They spend a lot of time being repaired even under the best of circumstances. Of course, there's a whole history of graft, the Fat Leonard scandal, where they were bribing admirals in the Pacific to get contracts to, help maintain the ships in port. Large numbers of naval officers indicted, crashes of ships because they were working too long and understaffed. The tailhook scandal of abuse of female members of the Navy. So all that's already been happening, and now I would be very surprised if every single member of our military was proud of a mission where you're bombing elementary schools and hospitals, and not to mention the fatigue. And if you're on a submarine or a carrier, it's exhausting. I mean, the carriers are like little villages, 4,500 to 5,000 people. The submarines, the movement is difficult. They're ships like the littoral combat ship that they tried to get rid of because even the Navy admitted it was a piece of junk. Congress wouldn't let them. So there's all this money pouring into the Navy on the theory that it's sort of our ace card, because they're like sort of, mobile aircraft carriers. Also a lot of crashes on these things. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of these naval officers, in the name of just slowing things down, maybe did try to sabotage. We may never know for sure, but that wouldn't be the first time in an unpopular war that such things have happened.
Well, apparently the Gulf is a hideous environment for, just anybody, let alone having a war with the high temperatures, high humidity, and they're sending the Marines. Do you have any idea of whether Trump's going to end this thing before the Marines get there, or what happens when they get there? It's hardly, it's two Marine expeditionary units, I think. That's about 5,000 men. You're not going to invade Iran with 5,000, are you?
No, and there's other things like we'll control the border to the Gulf. That's equally difficult. I don't know if this was like Carter's rescue mission or it's just a signal, but some experts have said a ground war in Iran would make Iraq look like a walk in the park, because it's a larger country, it's got different terrain, they have a trained guard. If they ever got involved in urban warfare, they'd be at a great disadvantage. And also, these troops, the ones that have been in many times, Many of them may have fought in Iraq or Afghanistan, and a lot of those folks felt like those wars were kind of pointless. They spent a lot of their time just protecting folks in their unit, hoping to get home. But back then, they did stop loss orders. You couldn't leave when you wanted to. I think all of that is affecting morale, although they're not going to say that because it's insubordination, but it's the feeling I get from people who've come out.
So, but my friend Colonel Hackworth, who's America's most decorated soldier, unfortunately he died because of exposure to Agent Orange. He used to say about the Pentagon and its budget, it's all about the toys and not the boys. So is that the situation?
Yes. Even on ammunition, leading up to Ukraine, they were spending less because they wanted to spend it on the big ticket items, missile defense, aircraft carriers, which is where the money is for the contractors. Congress would then take money from maintenance and training to add money for their favorite weapon. So a lot of the crashes have been because of lack of training. They're doing simulations instead of real flights. There's some military families, if you have a larger family, you might be on food stamps. They're cutting veterans' benefits at the same time they're saying this is for the troops. So it's a monumental fraud, and it's at the expense of the troops. Hundreds of thousands of them came back from Iraq and Afghanistan with traumatic brain injuries and PTSD and have not been yet given the help they need.
So just in closing then, Bill, is there any likelihood that the Congress and the Senate will stand up to Trump and Hegseth? There's now rumors that even Trump's fed up with Hegseth because he's so clearly unqualified. But what's your sense of whether or not they're going to make a compromise and instead of giving them the $700 billion extra that Trump wants, they'll give them maybe half of that, and that'll still be an obscene waste of money?
I think there's a fighting chance to stop some of it, but you can never underestimate the ability of Congress to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So they're going to need a lot of pressure from the outside.
And what do you think's going on with Hegseth? Is Trump fed up with him?
I think he is fed up with him, but their kind of vicious white nationalist, hate-driven view of the military is in sync. So I don't know what the guy's definitely incompetent, but that's not news in the Trump world. It's not usually enough to lose your job.
Well, William Hartung, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with William Hartung, who's a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute. His books include Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. And his latest book is The $1 Trillion War Machine, How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home. And he has an article at Forbes, $200 billion for the Pentagon means a longer war and more wasted funds. We can take a brief station break, back look into Trump's postponement of his summit with China's Xi while cutting off Persian Gulf oil China depends on.
He's the man with all the toys. Someone found a lighted house late one night, and he saw through the window a sight. A big man in a chair, and little tiny men everywhere. He's the man with all the toys.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now from Hong Kong is Frank Dikötter, who is the Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. He's the author of a number of books, including The Discourse of Race in Modern China and People's Trilogy, which documents the lives of ordinary people under Mao. His latest book is Red Dawn Over China, How Communism Conquered a Quarter of Humanity. Welcome to Background Briefing, Frank Dikötter.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you could make the case that Soviet communism was a political, military, and secret police system pretending to be an economy. But in China today, it seems that you have a ruthlessly capitalist economy pretending to be communism.
Yes and no. I can see that it looks, if we're talking about China today, I can see how it might very well look ruthlessly capitalist, not least because, of course, when we say, oh, we can't compete with the Chinese, the reality is that Chinese companies cannot compete with other Chinese companies. It's cutthroat. It's pretty much a race to the bottom with, cuts at every level, including, of course, the absence of labor unions. So there's no competing with China. But you got to realize that underneath all of that, there is a framework, and that framework is a Marxist one in the sense that the state does own, in Marxist parlance, the means of production. In other words, the land, communications, capital, everything that goes into production is directly or indirectly owned by the Communist Party. 99.5% of bank assets belong to the state. All the land belongs to the state, etc., etc. In that sense, it's classic Marxism, although not, of course, classic Maoism.
Well, but it's called the People's Republic. But the people, the working class, as you say, you can't form a union. They work from 9 to 9, awfully long hours, in a kind of, seems to be a sort of militant way of making China's economy great. But it's worse in terms of inequality than here in the United States between the rich and the poor. And a lot of the rich are the princelings, the relatives of the Communist Party leaders. So it doesn't come across to me as pretty much the People's Republic. It's
yes, well, indeed. In fact, the Constitution says it's a people's democratic dictatorship, a typical Orwellian term, which of course invokes the people, but decides that the party must make all decisions on behalf of them, so they're not allowed to vote. I think the point really is not so much the difference between rich and poor, which of course is enormous in the case of the People's Republic, but the fact that there is a line running through the country which separates really people from the countryside from people in the cities, and they are unequal in terms of social access to hospitals, education, other resources, in terms of law. And not only that, you have about 300 million migrant workers, roughly a third of the workforce, who are treated like second-class citizens. One hesitates to use the term citizen, like an apartheid system, the one you had in South Africa, with zero access to of course, any form of protection, with no unions, no basic freedoms, to be moved and removed at the will of the state, bonded servants to some extent. So that's the key, really, that so much of this growth is based not just on subsidies, not just on the state being able to move large resources at its disposal, but also the fact that such a great proportion of the workforce doesn't benefit from any of the basic freedoms we would take for granted.
so your new book, Red Dawn Over China: How Communism Conquered a Quarter of Humanity, it can't be making the party leaders, Xi Jinping and company, very happy. You're in Hong Kong, which used to be independent and free, but Jimmy Lai's in prison, and I don't know whether anybody's looking over your shoulder. But the whole history of the Chinese Communist Party and the heroism during World War II and the Great Long March and all of the stuff that we learned about Mao Zedong and how he brought this country from abject poverty to the greatness of today. It's not exactly the story you're telling, is it?
No, it's not exactly. Now, of course, I am based in Hong Kong, but I'm also a full-time senior fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford. Now, I'm not sure Xi Jinping has read my book. In any event, I haven't received the email yet from him telling me what he thinks of it. But I think you're probably right. He can't be too pleased in that so much of the legitimacy of the Communist Party rests on what I call a myth, a fairy tale, that somehow the Chinese Communist Party liberated hundreds of millions of impoverished peasants through land reform and a heroic struggle against the Japanese. The reality, even if you look at their own sources, is that in the 1920s and 30s, before the Second World War, they were a tiny, minor party with no more than one member for every 1,700 people, even by 1940. After almost 20 years of existence, right? But in 1936, after the so-called Long March, which is basically a great defeat, there are about 40,000 followers of Mao in a country of 500 million. I mean, any European country, and in fact, even the United States by 1940, would have more communist members as a proportion of its population than China. It's hard to think of a country that would have been less prone, less inclined to follow communist messages than China. So what happens really is, of course, the Second World War. The Japanese do the job that the communists couldn't do, namely displace the central government. And in 1945, Stalin does in China what he does in Europe. In Europe, of course, there is the march towards Berlin, and he occupies half of Europe. Whereas in the Far East, 1 million soldiers from the Red Army are sent across the border from Siberia into Manchuria, a huge part of the country north of Beijing, north of the Wall of China, the size of about France and the United Kingdom combined. And they occupy all of it. And they stay there, and they turn over the countryside to the communists, and they proceed in 1945, 46, and 47 to arm the communists to the teeth. So that's the beginning of the Communist Party managing to actually acquire a grip and ultimately conquer power in 49.
But they weren't heroic during World War II, as there are movies that they've made about it. It was the nationalists who did most of the fighting. The communists, bided their time waiting for the war to end so they could go after the nationalists.
Well, indeed. And we talk about the nationalists as if in the from 1927 onwards, as if there is some sort of equivalent between nationalists on the one hand, under Chiang Kai-shek, and communists on the other, whereas in fact from 1928, the nationalists are the central government. And the central government is recognized as one of the 4 allies during the Second World War. They go into Burma with the Americans. They do all the fightings. The Japanese wage a brutal war, brutal, bombing cities, raping civilians, using chemical weapons when they can't fight in the field from 1937 onwards, and absolutely brutal. And of course, the population bears the brunt of these attacks, as well as the central government, which is displaced several times, and nonetheless, does prevail in 1945. But is then confronted with an enemy called the communists, who are backed by the Soviet Union, but unfortunately not allowed to fight by the United States.
Well, what do you think of what's happening now, though, with the US weakening itself further, with misadventures in the Middle East? Various presidents, particularly Obama and Biden, have tried to pivot away from the Middle East to what they consider to be the real challenge, which is China in the Pacific, and that keeps getting derailed. And now US foreign policy is so hostile towards its own allies that much of the world appears to be looking upon China as a stable, reasonable country compared to the United States.
Yes, it's an unfortunate side product of well, it's not a side product. It's central to all one-party states that they constantly they spend vast human financial resources on projecting an image of stability and strength, even if frequently behind that facade they're actually quite weak. And the People's Republic is very successful at it. And of course, this is just a sort of a gift in the sense that indeed across the world, large numbers of people who are not very well informed about the People's Republic tend to see it as a more stable entity, despite the fact that it has been threatening every single neighbor in the South China Sea, not to mention Taiwan, and of course along its other border, not least with India. So yes, what is one to make of it all? It's very difficult to say. I just much prefer to be a historian and wait, because it's so easy to reach judgments when we are still not quite aware of the unintended consequences of particular acts, not least the war with Iran. But one thing is for sure, namely that without the People's Republic of China, Iran would not survive for very long. It's the money from China that is poured into there that keeps it afloat. And there's also the weapons. And these weapons have proved to be, of defensive weapons, have proved to be extremely inefficient in the face of US and Israeli attacks. So that is something that would have Beijing very worried. And of course, the reality is also that as long as you have a threatening Iran, you basically have two fronts. China can rattle that cage in the Middle East at any one point. So I'm afraid we just have to wait and see.
Well, as I speak to you from my recording studio, I got a piece of the Berlin Wall sitting in front of me, and a picture of the lone Chinese man with his briefcase standing in front of a row of tanks at Tiananmen. And I wonder about what happened there. It's interesting to note that at the time at Tiananmen Square, of course, Gorbachev paid a visit and thought it was all too chaotic and left. The students had shown up in support of Hu Yaobang, who was a hero of theirs, and Zhao Ziyang was a moderate progressive leader by comparison. But the Hawks took over, and they couldn't find an army unit to drive the kids out of Tiananmen. They found an army unit, I think, down on the Vietnamese border that was ruthless enough to do the dirty work. And, I just wonder about, did they successfully extinguish any aspirations of freedom and democracy in China? Because it seems that after Tiananmen, the Communist Party decided to push nationalism and materialism as a way to extinguish aspirations for freedom and democracy.
Yes, absolutely. I was there, as a matter of fact, in Beijing during the month running up to June the 4th, and I actually did see the very first attempt by the army to enter Beijing, and of course civilians went out en masse and negotiated with the soldiers, who turned around and left. And then they indeed, as you pointed out very, very accurately, had to appeal to troops much further afield to come and crush the local population. So the point really is that indeed for a good 20, 30 years afterwards, there is, at least for those people who are living in cities, not the countryside, but living in cities, there is indeed great material progress. But that doesn't mean they have abandoned their democratic aspirations. I think the key to understanding China today is that so many people within the cities are no longer beneficiaries of whatever economic reform there might be. And that dates pretty much from COVID. And you got to remember that at the end of COVID, people were so fed up, not least in Shanghai, being locked up for months on end and treated really like prisoners, virtual prisoners at home, that they began to protest, forcing the regime to turn around completely from one day to the next and lift all restrictions without following it up with any sort of healthcare. So clearly there is a change, not just in the mood of of city people, but also a widespread feeling that whatever economic reforms are taking place, they no longer benefit families either in the countryside or in the cities. So there's a great sense of disenchantment, and that I find very interesting.
But back to Gorbachev's visit at the time in Tiananmen, of course, the Soviet Union unraveled because in order to have perestroika, which is restructuring the economy, they came upon this notion of glasnost, of allowing people to speak freely. And what happened was the emperor had no clothes and the whole system collapses. The communist leadership, after they purged the liberals, they decided to have unlimited perestroika, but absolutely no glasnost. And I'm wondering about today, what's going on with Xi Jinping. You know, he's not a particularly educated person to begin with. He's purging the military. And I'm just wondering at what point, you know, with youth unemployment, etc., you know, we keep thinking they're taking over the world and all that stuff. But it does seem that in many ways, the leadership and people like Xi Jinping they're not trying to conquer the world. They're busy looking over their shoulder.
I think you're absolutely right. The leadership decides to repress any demand for political reform brutally, has done so by sending some 200 tanks and 100,000 soldiers into Beijing on June the 4th, 1989, and has been doing so ever since to really not nip anything in the bud. You know, an old lady who will protest somewhere during the Olympics in 2008, a bookseller in Hong Kong, you just crush this the moment it appears. And on the other hand, what appears to be, relative freedoms within the economy, but the key, if you wish, the key point, the key parallel, the key issue for both Gorbachev and Xi Jinping is that you simply cannot reform a communist system. It's not reformable. You can do a great deal. You can allow, as happened under Deng Xiaoping, the farmers to cultivate the land as they see fit. You can allow private entrepreneurs to set up businesses. You can allow for the economy to somehow thrive within certain limits, but these limits constrain what can be done. And I think we've reached the end of the road now. All the easy reforms have been done, but the real estate sector has tanked completely and has been going downhill for a few years. Infrastructure, they poured vast amounts with the debt-fueled model of growth. They've poured just zillions into infrastructure, and that expansion is over now too. So out of these three engines of growth, all that is left is exports, and they export like there's no tomorrow. They're selling the kitchen sink, all of it for extremely tiny margins. So the economy is definitely receding. It's shrinking, as the New York Times quite accurately pointed out a few days ago. So what does that do? I think it goes along with some sort of paranoia on the part of the leadership. You know, when the man in charge, 12, 13 years after coming to power, is still purging the army, then there is something quite wrong. When you have a central military commission that should have 7 people on it, and only 2 remain, including Xi Jinping himself, that tells you something. And that tells you that the man cannot rely on the army. And then the question is, who else can he count on?
Well, he's certainly purging the higher ranks of the army, and I don't know what the future is, but I thank you for your book, because I think it's an important exploration of the kind of hidden history of this driving force of the Communist Party, which again seems paradoxical to me that, you know, I just don't know whether this is all about control as opposed to ideology.
Well, it's at heart a Leninist system, and the Leninist system, Lenin takes over power in 1917 and comes up with this model where revolution doesn't come from below, but is imposed from above by a party that seizes power. So a Leninist system is basically an absolute monopoly over power. And the Communist Party of China is not willing to let go of that monopoly, and is not really willing to let go of the commanding heights over the economy. So that's really it. And why are they afraid of letting go? Probably because they realize that they wouldn't last very long.
Well, Frank Dikötter, I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Frank Dikötter, who's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a chair professor of humanities at the University of Hong Kong. He's the author of a number of books, including The Discourse of Race in Modern China and People's Trilogy, which documents the lives of ordinary people under Mao. And his latest book is Red Dawn Over China, How Communism Conquered a Quarter of Humanity. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes out.